Boston in the 1600s was a raw frontier settlement clinging to 3 hills and a narrow peninsula, home to barely 3,000 souls by 1680. This was the Puritan capital of New England, a place of muddy lanes, timber houses, and unshakable conviction. In this video, I use modern AI tools to bring historic paintings, engravings, and prints to life, allowing us to shift perspective, change camera angles, and move through the same scenes in ways their original artists never could. We'll walk streets that no longer exist, stand before buildings long vanished, and witness a world defined by faith, fear, and survival. First, I want to talk about the earliest settlement itself. This view shows Boston as it appeared around 1630, just months after John Winthrop and his fellow Puritans arrived aboard the Arbella. The peninsula is narrow, barely connected to the mainland by a slim neck of land called Boston Neck, submerged at high tide. In the foreground, you see crude shelters and tents clustered near the shore. The midground reveals timber frames rising, the beginnings of permanent homes. In the background, 3 hills dominate the skyline: Copp's Hill to the north, Beacon Hill at the center, and Fort Hill to the south. The air smells of salt marsh, wood smoke, and fresh-cut pine. Men haul logs from the forest. Women boil laundry in iron kettles. Children scatter along the shoreline, collecting clams. The settlement hums with the sound of hammers, saws, and the lowing of cattle driven down from pasture. But survival here was never certain. Disease swept through the colony in waves: smallpox, measles, dysentery. Winters were brutal, supplies ran short, and the Puritans knew they were watched by native Massachusetts people whose land this had been, by rival European powers, and by God himself, they believed. Every failure felt cosmic. This settlement mattered because it was the seat of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, a religious experiment meant to be a city upon a hill, a model Christian commonwealth. The future of Puritan New England rested on these muddy shores. Within 2 decades, the tents were gone. Proper timber houses lined the first streets. By 1650, Boston had become the largest town in New England. Today, almost nothing from this earliest settlement survives above ground. The original shoreline now lies buried beneath landfill and modern buildings. This view shows the first Boston townhouse, built in 1657 at the head of King Street, near what is now State Street. The building is 2 stories, timber-framed with clapboard siding and a steep roof. In the foreground, merchants gather beneath the arcade on the ground floor, trading goods and gossip. The midground reveals the building's balcony, where officials make public proclamations. In the background, the street slopes down toward the harbor. Inside, the town conducts its business. The council meets upstairs. Below, traders sell cloth, tools, sugar, rum, and molasses. The smell of tobacco hangs in the air. Voices echo, haggling over prices, arguing over permits, exchanging news from England. But commerce here was tangled with control. The Puritan authorities regulated nearly everything: what you could sell, what you could wear, even what you could say. Dissenters were fined or whipped, Quakers were banished, and the townhouse was where many of these verdicts were announced, sometimes to jeering crowds. This building mattered because it was the nerve center of colonial government and trade. Laws were debated here, taxes were set here, power radiated outward from this spot. The original townhouse burned in the Great Fire of 1711. A new brick structure replaced it in 1713, what we now call the Old State House. Remarkably, that building still stands today at the intersection of State and Washington Streets, dwarfed by skyscrapers but unmistakable. This view shows the first church meetinghouse, built around 1640 near what is now the corner of State and Devonshire Streets. The structure is plain, deliberately so. Timber walls, no steeple, no ornamentation. In the foreground, men and women file through the narrow door, dressed in dark woolens and white linens. The midground shows the building's stark simplicity. In the background, other timber houses cluster close.
Inside, the space is cold and bare. Hard wooden benches, a high pulpit. No music, no decoration, only the Word of God, delivered in sermons that could last 3 hours. The air smells of damp wool and candle tallow. Outside, you hear the creak of cartwheels and the clang of the blacksmith's hammer. But worship here was compulsory and watched. Missing services brought fines. Speaking out of turn could mean the stocks or worse. The meeting house was where the community gathered, but also where it policed itself. Sins were confessed publicly. Heretics were condemned. This building mattered because the Puritan faith was Boston. Church membership determined who could vote, who could hold office, who belonged. The meeting house was the heart of civic and spiritual life. The original structure was replaced several times as the congregation grew. By the 1700s, it had become the Old South Meeting House, a larger brick building that still survives today on Washington Street, a site you can still visit. This view shows Boston's waterfront around 1670, bustling with ships, sailors, and cargo. In the foreground, barrels of salt cod and lumber are stacked along the shore. The midground reveals wooden docks jutting into the harbor, where sloops and ketches are tied up. In the background, the open water stretches toward the islands. The air is thick with the smell of tar, fish, and brine. Sailors shout in a dozen accents: English, Dutch, West Indian. Merchants inspect shipments of sugar and rum from the Caribbean, furs from the interior, ironware from England. Seagulls wheel overhead. But the waterfront was also dangerous. Fires started easily among the warehouses. Thieves worked the docks at night. And disease arrived by ship: yellow fever, typhus, smallpox. Every vessel could carry death in its hold. This area mattered because Boston's survival depended on the sea. Fishing, shipbuilding, and trade with the West Indies made the town wealthy. The waterfront was where fortunes were made and lost. By 1710, the town had built Long Wharf, stretching nearly 2,000 feet into the harbor, the longest pier in North America at the time. Today, a much shorter version of Long Wharf still exists, now surrounded by modern development and the New England Aquarium. This view shows Boston Common around 1680, a broad stretch of open land set aside for public use. In the foreground, cattle graze on scrubby grass. The midground reveals a well-worn path crossing the common. In the background, the rooftops of the town rise along Tremont Street. The common serves many purposes. Militia drills are held here. Livestock graze. Laundry is spread on bushes to dry. Children play rough games. The smell is earthy: manure, trampled grass, wood smoke from nearby houses. But the common was also a place of punishment and death. The town gallows stood here. Criminals were hanged. Witches, or those accused of witchcraft, faced execution. Pirates met their end in public view. Crowds gathered to watch, sometimes numbering in the hundreds. This land mattered because it was shared space in a tightly controlled society. It belonged to no one and everyone. It was where the community came together for work, for judgment, for spectacle. The Common was never built over. It remains today as Boston Common, America's oldest public park, still occupying roughly the same 50 acres it did in the 1600s. This view shows the North End around 1660, a growing neighborhood near Copp's Hill. In the foreground, timber houses crowd narrow lanes. The midground reveals a small burying ground on the hillside. In the background, the harbor is visible beyond the rooftops. This is a working neighborhood. Shipwrights, rope makers, sail makers, and laborers live here. The smell of tar and oakum fills the air. The sound of hammers and saws never stops. At night, taverns glow with candlelight, and voices rise in argument or song. But the North End was also cramped and combustible. Houses stood shoulder to shoulder, their chimneys close enough to spread fire in minutes. Sanitation was poor, wells were shallow, disease spread quickly, and when smallpox struck in 1677, the North End suffered terribly. This area mattered because it housed the men who built Boston's ships and fed its maritime economy. Without the North End, there would be no waterfront trade. Copp's Hill Burying Ground, established in 1659, still exists today, one of the oldest cemeteries in Boston, with gravestones dating back to the 1600s. You can still walk among them. This view shows the aftermath of Boston's first Great Fire, which broke out in November 1676 near the waterfront. In the foreground, charred timbers smolder. The midground reveals whole streets reduced to ash and rubble. In the background, surviving buildings stand like teeth in a broken jaw. The fire started in a warehouse and spread with terrifying speed. Timber houses, tar, rope, and gunpowder fed the flames. Sparks leapt from roof to roof. People fled with what they could carry. Bucket brigades were useless. The fire burned until there was nothing left to burn. 45 buildings were destroyed, more than a tenth of the town. Families lost everything. Merchants were ruined. The smell of smoke lingered for days. This disaster mattered because it forced Boston to rebuild smarter. New regulations required brick chimneys and wider streets. The town began to look less like a frontier camp and more like a city. By 1680, most of the damage had been repaired, though some lots remained empty for years. Today, no trace of the fire remains visible, but the streets it reshaped, like Milk Street and Battery March Street, still follow their colonial paths. This view shows the town's stocks and pillory, standing near the townhouse around 1670. In the foreground, a man is locked in the pillory, his head and hands clamped between wooden boards. The midground reveals a small crowd jeering and throwing rotten vegetables. In the background, the townhouse looms. Punishment here is public and humiliating. Drunks, thieves, liars, and blasphemers are displayed for hours, sometimes days. The smell is foul. The taunts are cruel. Some offenders bear the marks for life, ears cropped, cheeks branded, backs scarred from the whip. But this was considered justice, swift, visible, and communal. The Puritans believed sin must be exposed and shamed. Private punishment was no punishment at all. This practice mattered because it enforced social order through fear and shame. Everyone knew what happened to rule breakers. By the mid-1700s, the use of stocks and pillory had declined, replaced by fines and imprisonment. Today, no original stocks survive in Boston, though the Old State House Museum displays replicas.
This view shows Boston's first almshouse, established in 1664 near the Common. In the foreground, a timber building with small windows stands behind a low fence. The midground reveals a narrow doorway where the poor enter. In the background, the Common stretches away. Inside, the destitute are housed: widows, orphans, the sick, the aged. Conditions are grim. Beds are shared. Meals are thin gruel and hard bread. The smell is of unwashed bodies and sickness. Work is required: spinning, sewing, breaking stones, anything to justify the charity. But this was also a place of control. The poor were kept separate from respectable society. Idleness was punished. The line between help and imprisonment was thin. This institution mattered because it marked Boston's first organized response to poverty. As the town grew, so did the number of people who couldn't support themselves. The almshouse was relocated and rebuilt multiple times over the centuries. By the 1800s, it had become a sprawling complex. Today, no trace of the original 1664 building survives, though the site near Park Street is now part of Boston Common.
This view shows Boston in 1676. During King Philip's War, a brutal conflict between New England colonists and native Wampanoag, Nipmuc, and Narragansett forces. In the foreground, refugees from outlying towns crowd the streets, carrying bundles and children. The midground reveals militia forming up near the common. In the background, smoke rises from distant burning settlements. The town is gripped by fear. Raids have destroyed frontier villages. Hundreds are dead. Food is scarce because farms have been abandoned. The smell of fear is sharper than any smoke. But Boston itself was never attacked. Its walls, hastily built wooden fortifications, were never tested. Still, the war reshaped the colony. Native power in southern New England was broken. English expansion accelerated. This conflict mattered because it defined the border between colonist and native, between civilization, as the Puritans saw it, and wilderness. The war's end in 1678 secured Boston's position as the unchallenged English capital of the region. Today, almost no physical remnants of King Philip's War exist in Boston, though the conflict's consequences, the near-total displacement of indigenous peoples, shaped the city's geography forever. Standing in modern Boston, surrounded by glass towers and rushing traffic, it's almost impossible to picture that raw timber town of the 1600s. But beneath the pavement, traces remain. Old street patterns, burying grounds, foundation stones. The past isn't as distant as it seems. If there's another city, moment, or scene you'd like me to reconstruct with AI, whether it's medieval London, ancient Rome, or early New York, let me know in the comments. Again, thank you so much.